My name is Emma Thompson, and I am 29 years old. For most of my life, I believed that love from a parent was something you had to earn, something you had to work toward with good grades and quiet obedience and a smile that never asked for too much. I believed this so completely, so deeply in the marrow of my bones, that it took me until I was sitting alone in a rented apartment in Seattle, 3,000 miles from the house I grew up in, eating cereal for dinner because I'd forgotten to grocery shop again, to finally understand that what I had been given my entire childhood was not love with conditions. It was something else entirely. It was a role. I had been cast as the backup daughter, the understudy. The one you call when the leading actress isn't available. The moment that changed everything, the moment that split my life cleanly into before and after, the way a scalpel divides tissue, happened on a Tuesday in October. I was sitting at my desk at work, the kind of Tuesday that smells like burnt coffee and fluorescent light, when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Not a call, a text. It said, "Emma, I know we haven't spoken in a while. Your aunt's birthday dinner is Saturday. We'd love if you could come." I stared at that message for 6 full minutes. I know because my phone screen timed out twice. It had been 11 months since she'd contacted me. 11 months since the last time she'd cancelled our lunch plans, the third cancellation in a row, because my older sister Diane had surprised her with concert tickets. 11 months of silence from her end, during which I had sent birthday cards, left 2 voicemails, and once, on a night I'm not proud of, driven 40 minutes to her neighborhood, parked outside and then driven back home without knocking. And now the text, "We'd love if you could come." The "we" of course meant Diane. Diane was busy that weekend. And so here I was again, wanted but only because the first choice wasn't available. I did not respond. I put my phone face down on my desk. I went back to my spreadsheet. And something inside me, something that had been pulling at its stitches for years, finally came loose and stopped trying to hold itself together. Before I tell you the rest of this, and there is so much more, the kind of much more that keeps you up at night replaying conversations, searching for the exact moment things went wrong, wondering if there was ever a version of this where you didn't end up sitting in a parking lot outside your mother's neighborhood at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, I want to tell you about who I was before I understood any of this, because this story doesn't start with the text in October. It starts much, much earlier. It starts when I was 7 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway in my socks, watching my mother French braid Diane's hair and thinking, I could learn to braid. If I learned to braid, maybe she would do mine too. I grew up in a medium-sized house in a medium-sized town in Connecticut. My father, Richard Thompson, was an accountant with a dry sense of humor and a fondness for crossword puzzles. My mother, Carol Thompson, was a dental hygienist who kept the house very clean and had opinions about the right way to load a dishwasher. They were, by all external appearances, fine parents. They went to parent-teacher conferences. They kept food in the refrigerator. They drove us to activities. If you had asked any of our neighbors, they would have told you the Thompsons were a nice family. They were not wrong, exactly. They were just describing something from the outside, the way you'd describe a house before you'd been invited in, and discovered that one of the rooms had no light. Diane is 4 years older than me. She was, from the very beginning, the kind of child who commanded a room. Blonde where I was brown-haired, loud where I was quiet. She cried spectacularly and laughed even more so. She played soccer and got straight A's and had her first boyfriend at 13. She was, by every observable metric, the daughter you talked about at dinner parties. My mother lit up around Diane in a way that I spent years trying to recreate for myself, the way you might try to replicate a color you once saw in a painting but can never quite mix right. Diane was her passion project. I was, I think, someone my mother genuinely cared about but didn't quite know what to do with. I was quieter, more interior. I read books alone in my room and asked questions that made adults slightly uncomfortable, the kind of kid who says things like, "But if God created everything, who created God?" at dinner when the grandparents are over. I don't want to make my mother sound like a monster because she wasn't. That would be easier in some ways. Monsters you can simply fear. What my mother was, I have come to understand after years of therapy and a lot of honest conversations with myself, was limited. She loved in a specific way that happened to fit Diane like a glove and fit me like a coat belonging to someone else, technically wearable, technically a coat, but never quite right. She knew how to love a daughter who was present and loud and needed her. She didn't know quite what to do with a daughter who was present but quiet, who needed her in a way that was harder to see. The small examples accumulate over a childhood the way water accumulates in a basement, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. When I was 9, I had a piano recital. I had been practicing Für Elise for 3 months, not because anyone asked me to, but because I loved the way my fingers felt on the keys, the specific pleasure of a thing you can get wrong, and then with enough repetition get right. My mother came to the recital. She sat in the 3rd row. But Diane had a soccer game that afternoon, and my mother arrived 12 minutes late, after I had already played, and spent the remaining recital checking her phone for updates on Diane's game. I know it was 12 minutes because my teacher, Mrs. Pulowski, told me afterward that I had been wonderful, that she wished my parents could have seen it. I asked if my mother had arrived. Mrs. Pulowski paused for exactly the length of time it takes a kind adult to decide whether to lie or to soften. She said my mother had come during the second half. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand the texture of it. The way a childhood spent in second place doesn't feel, from the inside, like deprivation. It feels like normalcy. You learn the shape of your world and you call it home. You don't know there's a different kind of home where you might be first until you're old enough to visit other people's houses and notice that their mothers ask about their days and remember their answers. When I was 11, I won the school science fair. I built a working model of a water filtration system using gravel, sand, and activated charcoal. I'd read about it in a library book and spent 4 weekends testing variations. The project was genuinely good. My science teacher, Mr. Farrell, said it was one of the best he'd seen in 15 years. I won first place, a ribbon, and a $25 gift certificate to the school bookstore. My mother's response when I came home with the ribbon: "That's great, Em. Diane got the part she wanted in the school play. She's going to be Maria in The Sound of Music. Isn't that wonderful?" She hugged me briefly, patted my back. She called 3 people that evening to tell them about Diane's part. I ate my dinner and went to my room and read a book and told myself it was fine and believed it because what was the alternative? Here's what I want you to understand about patterns. They work on you slowly. No single moment is enough to break you. It's the accumulation. It's the 100 small moments of being the secondary character in your own family's narrative. It's the way your mother tells the story of your sister's first day of high school at every family gathering, but has never once in 22 years of gatherings told the story of yours. It's the way her face arranges itself differently when she talks to each of you, open and animated for Diane, present but somehow distracted for you, like she is with you but thinking about something else. It's the way she asks about your life and you can tell from the quality of her listening whether she's actually hearing you or just waiting for you to finish so she can say something about Diane. I grew up knowing in some wordless cellular way that I was loved but not preferred, that I mattered but was not the main event. And because I loved my mother because she was my mother and she was good in many ways and I didn't have the language for what was wrong, I did what children do, I adapted. I became very good at being low maintenance, at not needing things out loud, at celebrating my own small victories quietly. In the privacy of my own interior, because I'd learned that taking up too much space with my wins made something uncomfortable happen in the room. I became expert at reading the temperature of my mother's attention and adjusting myself accordingly. I also, as a direct result of all this quiet interior practice, became quite good at hard things. When you don't get external validation, you either collapse or you develop an internal generator. I developed an internal generator. I read voraciously. I worked hard in school, not for approval, though I craved that too, but because the work itself felt like mine. It was the one territory where I was fully in charge, where the outcome was correlated to what I put in rather than to someone else's preferences. I graduated near the top of my high school class. I applied to colleges. I got into 2 good ones. When I told my mother, she said, "Oh, Emma, that's wonderful." She meant it. She gave me a real hug that day. And then she said, "Diane is thinking about doing her MBA at Columbia. Can you imagine? Columbia." And just like that, the hug was over without being over because we were already talking about Diane again. I went to the University of Connecticut on a partial scholarship. I majored in psychology because I wanted to understand people. Specifically, I wanted to understand my mother, though I wouldn't have admitted that for another 10 years. I took every class I could about human development and attachment and family systems. I did well. I made friends. I had a roommate named Jess who became my first experience of someone choosing me as a primary character in their life, and the surprise of that choseness, the warmth of it, nearly broke me open the first time I felt it. In my junior year, I decided I wanted to become a therapist, a family therapist specifically. The irony of this is not lost on me, but there it was. The child who had grown up learning to read the emotional weather of a room had discovered that this was, in fact, a professional skill. I applied to graduate programs in clinical psychology. I got into a good one, a very good one, actually. The University of Washington in Seattle, full funding, a stipend. It was far, far from Connecticut, and I told myself that was incidental, that I chose it for the program, not the distance. I was lying to myself. I chose it for both. Here is where the pattern stopped being ambient background noise and became the central, defining sound of everything. When I got into the UW program, I called my mother to tell her. She was happy for me, genuinely, I think. She said she was proud. That word, *proud, landed in my chest like something I'd been waiting years to hear and had given up expecting. We talked for 20 minutes, which was longer than most of our phone calls. She asked about the program, about Seattle, about whether I was scared to move so far away. For 20 minutes I was the main event. I was Emma, her daughter, the one going to graduate school in psychology. Not Emma, Diane's sister, not Emma, the other one. I should have known. I should have recognized that the upgrade in attention was situational, that it would dissolve as soon as the novelty did. But I was 23 and I had just been admitted to a program I was proud of, and I wanted to believe that this was a turning point, that my accomplishment had unlocked something. I moved to Seattle in late August. The city received me like it receives everyone, grey and green and smelling of salt water and pine needles, beautiful in a way that requires adjustment. I found a small apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, which I furnished almost entirely from Craigslist. I started my program. I threw myself into it with the fervor of someone who has found the thing they're actually made for. My supervisor in the first year, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, told me in November that I had a gift for sitting with discomfort, my own and my clients'. She meant it as a compliment. She had no idea how long I'd been practicing. I called my mother every Sunday. This was my rule, not hers. She was inconsistent. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't, sometimes she called back within the hour and sometimes not until midweek. When she answered, the conversations went one of three ways. Good, in which she asked about me and I told her things and she listened. Medium, in which she started with me and drifted, by the 12-minute mark, into a sustained monologue about Diane. And bad, in which Diane was mentioned in the first sentence, and I spent the next 20 minutes performing interest in my sister's life, while quietly swallowing the familiar compound of disappointment and guilt over the disappointment. Diane, by this point, was living in New York and working in marketing. She was good at her job and she knew it. She had a boyfriend named Mark who was handsome in the way that my mother appreciated, tall, professionally successful, the kind of handsome that photographs well at Christmas. Diane called my mother daily. They spoke on the phone the way some people text, quick, easy exchanges and longer ones, and everything in between. They had a closeness that I had stopped envying by this point and started simply acknowledging, the way you acknowledge weather. It exists, it is not personal, it simply is. What I want to tell you about my first 3 years in Seattle is that they were genuinely good. Not in spite of my family situation, not as a distraction from it, but in their own right. I was doing work I loved. I was building skills that felt real and substantial. I had friends, real ones, the kind you call when something goes wrong. My closest friend in the program was a woman named Halima, originally from Minnesota, who had a laugh that could reorganize a room and an ability to ask the right question at the right time that made her both the best friend and most slightly unnerving person I'd ever known. And I had in Dr. Nguyen a mentor who seemed to genuinely see me, who pushed me and trusted me and once said, during a supervision session, "Emma, you have more insight than most therapists I've worked with who have 10 years on you." I held that sentence in my hands for days. My mother called me on my birthday that first year. She sang the happy birthday song in her slightly off-key way, which I loved, and she asked about Seattle and my program and whether I was eating enough vegetables, which is its own kind of love. These were the good calls, the ones that reminded me that whatever was complicated between us, she was also my mother and she cared about me. The complications and the caring coexisted. They always have. It was in my second year of grad school that I began to notice, with the newly sharpened clinical eye I was developing, a specific and repeating pattern in my mother's behavior toward me. I was studying attachment theory that year, Bowlby, Ainsworth, the whole architecture of how early bonds shape adult relationships, and something in the literature kept catching on something in my chest like a burr. The way a particular pattern in the research kept resembling something I knew from the inside. My mother, I began to understand, had what researchers might call an inconsistent attachment style in her relationship with me. She wasn't cold, she wasn't cruel. She was inconsistent in a very specific way. Her warmth toward me, her attention and engagement, correlated inversely with the availability of Diane. When Diane was busy, traveling, preoccupied with her own life, my mother turned to me. She called more. She asked more questions. She was more present, more focused, more the mother I had always wanted. When Diane was available again, I receded. Not entirely, she didn't ignore me, but the quality of her attention shifted, the way a spotlight shifts when the main act takes the stage and the opening act steps back. I tested this hypothesis for several months because I am, at my core, a researcher. I tracked it informally in a notebook. The calls that came out of nowhere, the sudden warmth and interest, the "I've been thinking about you" messages, they had a pattern. They clustered in the weeks when Diane was on vacation with Mark, or when Diane had started a new project and was heads down unavailable, or when Diane had done something that briefly annoyed my mother. And they cooled when Diane returned. Every single time. I brought this to therapy. I had been in personal therapy since my second year of grad school, which is standard for trainees and also, in my case, extremely necessary. My therapist, a calm and precise woman named Dr. Ramirez, listened to me describe the pattern. She asked how it felt. I said it felt like being someone's second favorite restaurant, the one they love going to when their favorite is too crowded and forget about otherwise. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And how long have you been okay with being someone's second favorite restaurant?" I didn't answer for a long time. The thing about insight is that it doesn't automatically produce change. You can see a pattern clearly, label it correctly, understand its origins, have compassion for everyone involved, and still find yourself picking up the phone when your mother calls, still arranging yourself to be whoever she needs in that moment, still hoping that this call will be different, that this time you'll be the main event rather than the understudy. Understanding the mechanism doesn't automatically dismantle the hope. The hope is older than the understanding. It predates language. By my third year of grad school, I had grown substantially as both a clinician and a person. I had worked with clients navigating family estrangements, parentification, conditional love, the specific exhaustion of being the child who was never quite enough. I had sat with them in the hard parts and helped them build new stories about themselves. I had, with Dr. Ramirez's help, started building a new story about myself. The story I was building was not about my mother's limitations as a parent, it was about my own agency, about what I chose to do with what I'd been given, about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you make. My chosen family by this point was real. Halima was in it. Dr. Nguyen was in it in a different way. A few friends from my cohort who had become genuine anchors, and a man named Tobias who I had been dating for 8 months, who was kind and funny and genuinely interested in what I thought, and who had in 8 months shown me more consistent regard than I had experienced from my family in 25 years. With Tobias, I was not the backup plan, I was the plan. My mother liked Tobias when she met him over video call. She asked him thoughtful questions and laughed at his jokes. She called me the next day and said, "He seems wonderful, Emma, I'm happy for you." And she meant it. She genuinely meant it. That is the thing that makes all of this hard. She was not performing love for me. She did love me. She just loved me in second place, and she had never noticed that second place has its own particular cost. I want to tell you about the months leading up to October, the October of the text message, the October that broke something loose in me, because the story of that year is important. It was, in its own way, the year I had been waiting for, and also the year that cost me the most. In January of that year, my mother had a health scare. Not serious, ultimately, an irregular heartbeat that turned out to be benign after a lot of tests, but frightening in the weeks before they knew what it was. Diane handled this by flying home immediately, by being physically present, by accompanying my mother to appointments and updating the family text thread 4 times a day. I handled it from Seattle, which meant I handled it on the phone, by researching her condition and sending her careful summaries of what the tests were for, and what the outcomes might mean, by calling every other day, by ordering food delivery to the house and sending flowers and leaving a long voicemail that I worked on for an hour to get the tone right, not too alarmed, not too distant, exactly present. During those weeks my mother called me more than she had in years. She was frightened, and Diane, though present, was sometimes too close, too emotional, too reactive, which I knew from years of observing them together, sometimes made my mother feel like she had to manage Diane's feelings on top of her own. I was steady. I asked good questions. I helped her process the fear without amplifying it. She told me twice during those weeks that she didn't know what she'd do without me. That she was so grateful I was there, even from a distance. By March, the health scare had resolved. My mother was fine. Diane was back in New York. And the calls from my mother slowed again, normalized, settled back into the Sunday rhythm I maintained, and she sometimes reciprocated. The "I don't know what I'd do without you" was not retracted. It just stopped being relevant. I noticed this, I noted it. I talked about it with Dr. Ramirez. I said, "This is the pattern exactly as I described it in high definition." She said, "Yes." She asked what I wanted to do with that knowledge. I said I didn't know yet. She said that was okay, that I didn't have to know yet. Spring came. I was completing the final year of my doctorate, writing my dissertation on intergenerational transmission of attachment patterns in families with emotionally unavailable caregivers. I did not choose this topic to write about my mother, and I also absolutely chose it to write about my mother. Both things were true. My committee loved the proposal. Dr. Nguyen said it was the most personally committed dissertation topic she'd advised in years, and that this was a feature, not a bug. In June, Tobias and I decided to move in together. I told my mother on one of our Sunday calls. She was warm and excited. She asked about the apartment, about the neighborhood, about whether we'd gotten good light. She said she hoped I was happy. She sounded genuinely pleased. It was a good call. I felt for a few days after the specific tender hope that good calls always gave me. Maybe this is a new chapter. Maybe the distance and the work I've done and the life I'm building is showing her something. Maybe things are changing. In July, Diane got engaged. I want to be precise about this because the precise timing matters. I found out about the engagement not from my mother, not from Diane, but from my aunt, who called me on a Wednesday to congratulate me on my sister's wonderful news. I sat with this for a moment. I said thank you. I hung up and called my mother. "Were you going to tell me Diane got engaged?" "Oh, Emma, it just happened. Mark proposed Saturday night. It was so romantic. He took her to the restaurant where they had their first date. Didn't Diane text you?" "She hadn't. I've been so busy calling everyone, I assumed you knew. Isn't it wonderful?" It was wonderful. Diane's engagement was real and good, and I was happy for her, in the genuine way you can be happy for someone even when the way you found out was a small knife between the ribs. I said the right things. I asked the right questions. I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen with Tobias and told him what happened, and he said, very quietly, "I'm sorry," in the specific way he says it when he means it. After the engagement, my mother entered what I can only describe as a sustained Diane event. Not a moment or a week, but an entire season, call it the engagement summer, in which every conversation with my mother had Diane's wedding as either the main subject or the gravitational center around which everything else orbited. Venue research, dress shopping, guest list politics, catering decisions. The specific anguish of whether to seat my father's cousin Gerald next to my mother's college roommate, given their history. I participated in these conversations because I loved my mother and I understood that this was important to her, and because I am, at my core, a person who shows up for the people I love even when showing up is uncomfortable. What I noticed in the engagement summer was that my mother stopped asking about me. Not entirely, she wasn't cruel, she wasn't a caricature, but the space for Emma in our conversations contracted. Not because of any deliberate decision, I think, but because she had a main event again, and the main event was all-consuming, and I was, as I had always been, someone she loved in the margins of the main event. I remember one particular Sunday call in August. I had just submitted a chapter of my dissertation and gotten the best feedback of my program so far. Dr. Nguyen had written, "This is exceptional work," in the margin, and it had made me cry a little alone at my desk because I was proud and I was tired and I needed to hear it. I called my mother. I said, "I got great feedback on my dissertation this week." She said, "Oh, that's wonderful, honey. You work so hard." Did I tell you Diane found a venue? It's a vineyard in the Hudson Valley. I think I've been there actually, or somewhere near it. Anyway, it's gorgeous. She sent photos. I listened for 16 minutes about the vineyard. I said the right things. I hung up and I sat with the feeling for a long time. Not anger exactly, something more quiet and more tired. The feeling of being handed the supporting role so many times you've forgotten you ever auditioned for anything else. In September, I defended my dissertation successfully. I became Dr. Emma Thompson. There was a small dinner in Seattle. Halima was there, and Dr. Nguyen and Tobias, who had brought flowers and a bottle of good champagne and cried a little. Witchy Denny's. It was one of the best nights of my life. My mother called and left a voicemail, a good one, warm and genuine, saying she was so proud and she wished she could be there and she loved me. I saved the voicemail. I still have it. She did not come to my defense. She had been invited. I'd sent her the date 6 months in advance. She had a conflicting commitment, some planning event for Diane's engagement party. I do not believe she weighed the two and chose the engagement party. I believe she didn't notice there was a choice to make. And then October came. And then the text came, "Emma, I know we haven't spoken in a while. Your aunt's birthday dinner is Saturday. We'd love if you could come." I have spent a lot of time with that text. I have analysed it the way you analyse a dream, looking for what it reveals in what it assumes. The phrase "we haven't spoken in a while" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It presents the silence as mutual, symmetrical, a shared forgetting. It was not. I had called on my birthday. I had called the Sunday after my defence. I had texted on her birthday and gotten back a heart emoji 12 hours later. The silence she was namming was her asterisk silence, reframed as something we had both participated in equally. And the we'd love, the loving was contingent on Diane's absence, that we was built on Diane being busy that Saturday. I knew, sitting with that text, that this was the moment Dr. Ramirez had been describing, without calling it a moment. The moment when insight and action finally arrive at the same address. I had spent years understanding my mother's pattern and continuing to move within it, because understanding a cage doesn't automatically take you out of it. But something about that text, the specific unself-conscious compression of the entire dynamic into 6 words, "We'd love if you could come," cracked something open. I did not respond to the text. Not that day, not the next day. On the 3rd day my mother texted again, "Emma, did you see my message? I read it. I put my phone down." On the 6th day, "Emma, I hope everything is okay. Thinking of you, I read it. I put my phone down." This was not a dramatic or principled silence. I wasn't crafting a response or planning a confrontation. I was, honestly, in the middle of figuring out what I wanted to say, or whether I wanted to say anything, or whether the thing I most needed to do was simply stop being available on her schedule and see what happened when I did. I had spent 29 years adjusting my availability to fit the shape of my mother's need. I had always been reachable, always responsive, always ready to be warm and present when she turned toward me. I wanted to see just once what the silence felt like when it was mine instead of hers. The answer, it turned out, was, it felt like power, not malicious power, not revenge. It felt like standing up straight after years of accommodating a low ceiling. My mother called on day 8. I watched the phone ring. I did not answer. She called again on day 10. I watched it ring again. She texted, "Emma, I'm worried. Please just let me know you're okay." I texted back, "I'm fine, just busy," 2 words and a comma, which was more or less everything she had ever given me. She did not call again for 4 days. I want to be honest about what those weeks felt like, because I don't want to make this sound more triumphant or more simple than it was. The silence was mine and I had chosen it, but that doesn't mean it was comfortable. I missed her. Not the version of her that treated me as a backup plan. I didn't miss that at all, but the version I glimpsed on the best calls, the warm and curious one who asked good questions and laughed at my jokes. The version that sent care packages with too many snacks and left messages in her slightly off-key birthday song voice. I missed the mother I had always wanted her to be, more than I missed the one she'd actually been. That's a specific kind of grief. It has no clean edge. I talked to Dr. Ramirez about it. I talked to Tobias about it. Tobias was careful. He understood that this was my territory, my history, and that his role was to be present rather than to advise. But once, on a Sunday when I had let my mother's call go to voicemail for the 2nd time, he said, "I think what you're doing is brave." I said I wasn't sure it was brave. He said, "You've been brave in the wrong direction for a long time. This is brave in the right one." My mother over the following weeks seemed to be recalibrating. The texts became more frequent and then less performatively worried. "I miss you" instead of "I'm worried," which was a small but meaningful shift. She sent a card, an actual physical card, which arrived on a Thursday, that said she'd been doing a lot of thinking and she hoped we could talk soon. She didn't explain what she'd been thinking about. The card was tentative, uncertain, written in her careful handwriting with a purple pen. It was the most honest thing she'd sent me in years. I still didn't call. Here is what I was doing instead. I was living my life. I was finishing my last months of supervision hours toward licensure. I was seeing clients who were working through their own complicated family histories, and I was bringing the full weight of my understanding to that work, including the weight of what I was currently living. I was deepening my relationship with Tobias, who was becoming more family to me every day than anyone I'd grown up with. I was talking to Halima, who had graduated and moved back to Minneapolis but who I called twice a week. I was being Dr. Emma Thompson, who had earned that title, and was building a life that was wholly and genuinely hers. November came, Diane called me. This was unusual. Diane and I were not close, in the way that people who share a history but not a relationship are not close. We were friendly. We showed up to family events. We could maintain an hour-long conversation with goodwill on both sides. But we didn't call each other between events. When her name appeared on my phone that Sunday afternoon, I felt a small tightening in my chest that I recognized as anxiety masquerading as calm. I answered. Emma, her voice was careful, I could hear her selecting words. Mom is pretty upset, she doesn't know what she did wrong. I waited. I think she's been trying to reach you. I know, I said. She's not, she doesn't understand why you're not responding. I hear that. A pause, Diane recalibrating. Are you okay? I'm fine. Then what's going on? Because she's really worried and honestly I'm a little worried too. I thought about how to answer this. I had been sitting with the answer for 2 months. I said, I needed some space to think about my relationship with Mom and what I want it to look like. That's all. Diane was quiet for a moment. Did she do something? And there it was, the invitation to explain, to justify, to present my case to the mediator. I understood from my training and from 29 years of observing my family's dynamics exactly what was happening. Diane was not calling out of simple worry. Diane was calling because my absence had disrupted a system she occupied the center of, and the disruption required investigation. I was a background element in the family story, and background elements are not supposed to go quiet. I said, I don't want to talk about it through you, Diane. If Mom wants to talk, I'm open to a conversation with her, but I'm not going to process it this way. Another pause, longer this time. Okay, she said, I'll tell her, and then after a beat, you should know she really does love you. I know she loves me, I said. That's not what this is about. We hung up. I sat on the couch next to Tobias, who had been reading next to me and had stayed very still throughout the call. He asked how it went. I said, my sister called on my mother's behalf to ask why I'm not calling my mother. He said, I said, yes. He put his arm around me and went back to his book, and I leaned into him and stared at the ceiling and felt underneath everything a small firm core of rightness. My mother called that evening. I answered. The conversation was long, 47 minutes, which I know because I noticed the time when I picked up and when we hung up. It was one of the most honest conversations I had ever had with my mother. I won't give you every word of it, because some of it belongs to her and some of it belongs to me and the most private parts of it are not for the internet, but I will tell you what mattered. I told her as calmly as I could manage that I had been noticing a pattern in our relationship for several years, that I felt, consistently, like her attention and warmth toward me came and went based on Diane's availability rather than on any independent need or desire to connect with me. That when Diane was busy or absent, I moved to the front. When Diane was available, I receded. That I had felt like a backup plan my entire life, and that I had spent years accommodating this rather than namming it, because I didn't want to make her feel bad, and because I loved her, and because, frankly, I hadn't had the language for it until recently. She was quiet for a long time after I said this. Then she said, Emma, I don't think that's fair. I had expected this. I stayed calm. I said, I'm not asking you to agree right now. I'm asking you to hear what I'm telling you. She said, I love you and Diane equally. I said, I believe you love us equally. I'm not talking about love. I'm talking about attention and consistency. They're different things. Another silence, and then slowly she started crying. My mother is not a person who cries easily. This is something we have in common. The sound of it moved something in me the way it always does, and I had to consciously resist the old reflex to rush in and soothe her, to back off my own truth to manage her feelings. I sat with the sound and let it be. She said, I never meant to make you feel that way. I know, I said, I know you didn't. That's not the same as it not happening. More silence. Then, I didn't know you felt this way. I know, I said, that's partly what I'm trying to tell you. We talked for a long time after that, imperfectly, with long pauses and some repetition, and a few moments where I could feel us both reaching for the right words and not quite finding them. She didn't have a full epiphany. I wasn't expecting one. Real change in real people doesn't work that way. What she had, I think, was a genuine confrontation with something she had never quite looked directly at before, the way you sometimes avoid looking at a thing in a room for years, and then one day notice it's been there the whole time. At the end of the call, she said, "Can I call you on Sunday?" I said yes. She called on Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. Here is what I noticed in the calls that followed. They were different. Not completely different, not transformed overnight, not what I would describe as the realization of the relationship I had always wanted, but different in small, specific ways. She asked about me first, not always, but often enough that I noticed. She let my answers complete before moving to other subjects. Once, when she started talking about Diane's wedding planning and I was quiet for a moment, she stopped and said, "Sorry, I do this, don't I? Go to Diane." I said yes. She said, "I'm working on it." I said okay. December, Diane called again, this time for different reasons. She called to tell me she'd been thinking about what I'd said in November, not what I'd said to Diane, but what Diane assumed I'd said to my mother, because apparently my mother had told Diane we'd had a hard conversation. Diane said, "I think I owe you an apology." I was so surprised by this that I actually pulled the phone away from my face and looked at it for a moment. Diane said, "I think I've known for a while that Mom and I are close in a way that leaves you out, and I think I've been okay with that because it worked for me, and that wasn't fair." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is that all you're going to say?" I said, "I'm processing." She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that sounds surprised to be there. I said, "I appreciate you saying that, it means a lot." And I meant it. Not as a complete resolution, one phone call doesn't undo 30 years of a pattern, but as a genuine start, as evidence that the conversation I'd had with my mother had rippled somewhere real. Diane said, "Can I come visit you sometime, in Seattle?" I said yes. She came in February. We spent a weekend together that was strange and careful and also genuinely good. We went to Pike Place Market and ate chowder in paper cups and walked along the waterfront and talked about things we had never talked about before, like what it was like growing up as the favored one, which Diane had never really examined, and what it was like growing up in second place, which she had never really understood. We didn't solve anything. We didn't arrive at some finished, healed version of a sisterhood, but we started, and starting, I was learning, was its own thing. My mother and I continued our Sunday calls through the winter and into the spring. She came to visit in March, the first time she'd come to Seattle in the 3 years I'd lived there. She and Tobias spent an evening making dinner together and laughing about something I missed because I was in the other room, and the sound of her laughing in my kitchen in my apartment in my life was something I hadn't known I needed until I heard it. Was it perfect? No. There were still calls that fell back into old patterns, where the gravitational pull of Diane events overwhelmed everything else, where I felt myself receding to the margin again. There were moments where I had to say out loud, "Mom, I want to talk about me for a minute," and feel the slight awkwardness of making that request, and decide it was worth the awkwardness. There were moments where I saw the old dynamic starting and chose, deliberately, not to participate in it, not to be available as the backup plan, not to shrink myself to fit the space I'd always been assigned. Change, I have learned both professionally and personally, is not a destination. It's a practice. You don't arrive at healed. You practice healing the way you practice an instrument, imperfectly, repeatedly, sometimes badly, occasionally transcendently. My relationship with my mother is a practice now, not a fixed thing, a practice. I want to tell you about the moment that felt, to me, like the clearest proof that something had genuinely shifted. It was an April Sunday, several months into our new pattern. I had a work emergency the previous week, a crisis with a client that required extra hours and emotional energy, the kind of week that leaves you scraped out and quiet. I hadn't mentioned it to my mother because it would have required explaining things I couldn't explain, and also because I wasn't sure she'd ask the right questions. She called on Sunday, and she said before anything else, "How are you? And I mean really, you sounded tired last week." I had not told her I was tired last week. She had noticed. I said I had a hard week, and I told her about it, not the confidential parts but the texture of it, the emotional weight, and she listened, not in the waiting to talk way, in the actually hearing way. She asked good questions. She didn't once mention Diane. She said at the end, "You're doing really important work. I hope you know that." I sat with those words for a while after the call ended. I didn't save that voicemail. There wasn't a voicemail to save, but I kept the moment the way you keep a pressed flower, flat and dry and real. I want to go back now and tell you something I've been holding until this point, because it's the part of the story that lives in my body rather than my head, the part that requires the most honesty. Everything I've told you up to this point is true, but it's been told from a certain altitude. Retrospective, organized, the way stories settle when you've had time to process them. What I haven't yet told you is what it actually felt like, from the inside during the months of silence. Because the decision to stop being available, to let my mother face the quiet she'd created, was not clean or easy or free of cost. There is a particular kind of grief that lives in the space between who someone is and who you need them to be. I had named this in my therapy and with my clients and in my dissertation. I had charted its contours clinically. And yet the lived version of it, the way it sat in my chest during those weeks in October and November, heavy and formless and old, was something else entirely. No amount of professional understanding prepares you for the physical weight of finally admitting, to yourself and then to another person, that you have spent your entire life hopping for something you might never get. I cried in the shower a lot during October. I am not someone who cries frequently in general. I have my mother's stoicism in this regard, which is perhaps another thing we share that I haven't fully acknowledged. But there is something about hot water and enclosed spaces that permits what ordinary life doesn't. I cried for the recital my mother arrived 12 minutes late to, for the science fair ribbon, for the 20 minutes on the phone the day I got into grad school, those beautiful 20 minutes, and the way they receded almost immediately, for every Sunday call where the topic was Diane and I said all the right things and hung up and sat very still for a while, for the version of my mother who appeared during the health scare, the attentive and warm and present one, and then left again when the crisis passed. I cried for the child version of myself who decided, in the kitchen doorway watching her mother braid Diane's hair, that maybe she just needed to ask. Who learned to braid? Who asked? Who noticed that her mother braided her hair twice and then stopped, and who didn't ask again because she had started to understand that some things you can only ask for once before the asking itself becomes too much. I also, and this is harder to admit, cried for my mother, because whatever my experience was, she didn't choose it with malice. She didn't sit down one day and decide to love her daughters on an unequal schedule. She was, I believe, doing what she knew, loving in the way she'd been shaped to love, by her own mother and her own history, patterns moving down through generations like rivers, following their old courses even when the landscape changes. She hurt me in ways she didn't fully see, and I believe she genuinely couldn't see them, the way you can't see your own blind spot no matter how precisely you know it's there. This is, I think, the most important thing I have come to understand about my mother. Her limitations are not the same as her indifference. She is limited. She is also not indifferent. Both things are true, and the truth of both has been necessary for me to hold simultaneously, because if I only held one I would end up either forgiving everything without namming anything, or namming everything without forgiving anything. Neither of those paths leads anywhere good. My therapist, Dr. Ramirez, had been helping me with this for years before I was ready to do anything about it. She is careful and precise and does not offer comfort that isn't earned, which is the only kind of comfort worth having. In one of our sessions during those October weeks, she said something I've carried with me since. She said, "The goal isn't to make your mother into the parent you needed. You're too old for that and she may not be capable of it. The goal is to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, you want with the person she actually is." That reframe was, for me, genuinely liberating, because the question of what kind of relationship do I want with the person she actually is a completely different question from how do I get her to love me the way I need. The first question I can answer. The second question I'd been trying to answer for 29 years without success. What I wanted, what I decided I wanted, was not nothing. I did not want estrangement. I did not want to lose my mother. What I wanted was a relationship on honest terms, a relationship where I was not available as a backup plan, a relationship where I could ask for her attention without it feeling like an imposition, a relationship that had real room in it for me as a full and primary person, not a peripheral one. And I decided, sitting in my Seattle apartment in October with my mother's text unanswered on my phone, that the only way to find out if that was possible was to stop cooperating with the version of the relationship that wasn't working, stop showing up as the backup option and see what happened, not punish her, not be cold or cruel, simply decline quietly to be available on her terms when her terms were conditional and inconsistent. Let the silence exist, see if the silence changed anything. It changed some things, not everything, but some things. I'm going to tell you something I haven't told many people. There was a moment, sometime in November of that year, when I almost broke. When the weight of the silence and the grief and the uncertainty about whether anything would ever actually change became more than I could comfortably carry alone. I was in my apartment alone. Tobias was at a work dinner, and I had just gotten off the phone with Halima, who had listened to everything I needed to say and said all the right things, and somehow even Halima's rightness wasn't enough that night. I sat on my kitchen floor for a while, not because I was dramatically falling apart, but because sometimes the floor is the right place. Solid, unambiguous. I thought about calling my mother, not to capitulate. I wasn't going to undo what I'd started, but just to hear her voice, to check whether she was there. This is the strange intimacy of even complicated family relationships. The people who have hurt you are also sometimes the people whose voices you most need to hear. The very person whose absence you're enforcing is the person you miss. I didn't call, I made tea instead. I sat on the kitchen floor with the tea and a book I wasn't really reading, and I let the night be what it was, uncomfortable, uncertain, real. And then it passed, and I got up, and I went to bed. That's what getting through hard things looks like, mostly. Not a dramatic moment of clarity, a cup of tea and then getting up off the floor, going to bed, waking up the next morning and continuing. This is what I tell my clients who want to know how you survive the hard things. You survive them the way you survive everything, incrementally, imperfectly, with whatever is at hand. In the spring, several months after everything had shifted, my mother and I had a conversation that felt, to me, like the truest one we'd ever had. She called on a Sunday. She always called on Sundays now, and she was almost never late, which was itself a small and real change. We talked about my week, about a session that had gone particularly well, about a book she was reading that she wanted to recommend. And then, after a comfortable pause, she said, "Emma, I've been thinking a lot since we talked in November." I said, "Okay." She said, "I think you were right, about the pattern. I didn't want to see it and I spent a few weeks arguing with myself about whether it was really true. But I think it is. I think I've been closer to Diane in a way that hasn't always been fair to you, and I'm sorry for that." I held the phone for a moment. She said, "You're not a backup. You were never supposed to be a backup. I'm sorry that's what it felt like. I want to tell you that I said something perfect and wise and that we both cried and it was cathartic and complete. But this is real life, not a movie, and what I actually said was, 'Thank you, Mom, that means a lot.' And then I cried a little, quietly turned away from the phone, and she talked about the book she was reading, and I collected myself and we talked for another 20 minutes about ordinary things, and it was genuinely one of the best calls we'd ever had. Not because it resolved everything. It didn't. Not because it undid the years. It couldn't. But because it was honest and it was mine, and she had offered it without being cornered into it, which meant something. I said at the beginning of this that the text in October split my life into before and after. I want to complicate that a little now that I've told you the whole story, because the truth is the split had been coming for years. It had been coming since the kitchen doorway when I was 7, since the piano recital, since the science fair ribbon, since every backup plan. The text in October wasn't the split. It was the moment I finally noticed the split that had already happened and decided, consciously, not to paper over it anymore. And that decision, the decision to stop smoothing over the crack, to let the silence exist, to be honest about what I needed and unavailable when the terms were wrong, that decision was the most important thing I did, not because it fixed everything. It didn't, not because it produced a perfect relationship. It hasn't, but because it was the first time in 29 years that I treated my own experience as a primary fact rather than a secondary concern. The first time I let my own discomfort speak rather than subsuming it to manage someone else's comfort. This is what I was trying to tell you from the beginning, though I've taken a long time to get here. The story isn't about my mother, it's about me, about the years of making myself small enough to fit a role I'd been assigned, and the moment I stopped and what came after. What came after wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect. My relationship with my mother is better and it is still imperfect and it will always be both. My relationship with Diane is newer and more tentative and more honest than it has ever been. My relationship with myself, with the woman who won a science fair and no one came, who learned to braid her hair hopping for something, who drove to her mother's neighborhood at 11 p.m. and turned around without knocking, is the one that has changed most. I know now that I am not a backup plan. I am the plan, not because anyone declared it. Not because my mother finally saw me clearly or Diane finally apologized, or the childhood rearranged itself in hindsight into something more equitable, but because I decided it was true, and I stopped participating in the version of things that said otherwise. Let me be more specific about the months that followed my mother's call, because I don't want to give you an arc that resolves too cleanly. The reality of family change is that it happens in increments so small they're almost invisible until, one day, you look back and realize the landscape has shifted. My mother and I began a practice, not a declared practice, not something we named, but a real one of talking honestly about the relationship. Not every call, not dramatically, but there was now in our calls a permission to say difficult things that hadn't previously existed. When I felt the old pattern asserting itself, when Diane was suddenly occupying all available conversational space, when I noticed myself receding, I would say carefully, "I want to come back to something you asked me earlier." It was a small intervention, a tiny reorientation. My mother was getting better at noticing when she drifted and at returning. The first time she returned on her own without me prompting, without an intervention, was sometime in February. We were mid-conversation about Diane's wedding venue and my mother stopped herself. Mid-sentence, she said, "I'm doing it again, aren't I?" I said, "A little." She said, "Tell me something about your week." And then she listened. This moment was small and is, I suspect, invisible to anyone who hasn't spent a lifetime waiting for it, but to me it was enormous. It was evidence that something real was shifting, not from words but from attention. Tobias and I got engaged in June. I want to be honest about how I told my mother, because the telling was its own kind of test. I called her on a Wednesday, not a Sunday, which was itself a statement that I was calling because I had something to say rather than because it was time. I said, "Mom, I have news. Tobias proposed last night." She made a sound I can only describe as pure happiness, the kind that is involuntary and immediate and completely without calculation. She said, "Emma, oh Emma." And she was crying, and this time I was too, and we were both laughing a little through it, and she said, "I'm so happy for you, tell me everything." And she meant tell me everything. She meant all of it, how he did it, what he said, what I said, how I felt, where we were, whether the ring was what I'd have chosen if I'd chosen it myself, whether we'd thought about timing, whether I was happy, was I so happy. She wanted to know all of it, not because Diane was busy that week, not because I was filling a space, but because her daughter was engaged and she wanted to be present for it. I told her everything. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. It was the longest call we'd ever had and it never once drifted from me. After I hung up, I sat for a moment. Tobias was in the kitchen making us celebratory pasta, and I could hear the sound of the water and the clattering of the pan. I thought about the 7-year-old in the doorway. I thought about the piano recital. I thought about the October text and the months of silence and the 47-minute call in November. I thought about the slow and imperfect and ongoing recalibration of a relationship that had always loved me but hadn't always known how to show it. And I thought, we are not done, this is not finished, but this is real, this is more real than it's ever been. Diane, when she heard about the engagement, called me directly. She didn't call my mother first, she called me. She said, "I heard the news, I'm so happy for you, he's wonderful." And then she said, "Can I be a bridesmaid? Only if you want, no pressure, but I want to be in it if you'll have me." I thought about this. I thought about the phone call in November where she'd admitted she'd been complicit in a dynamic that hadn't been fair to me. I thought about the weekend in Seattle, the chowder in paper cups, the careful and real conversation we'd had about what it had cost us both to be who we were in our family. I said, "Yes, I want you in it." She exhaled a long, relieved sound. She said, "Good, great, okay." And then after a pause, "Emma, I know things have been weird between us for a long time. I'm going to try harder, for real." "I know," I said, "me too." I want to circle back to something I said at the beginning, that I had been cast as the backup daughter, the understudy, the one you call when the leading actress isn't available. I chose that theatrical language deliberately because there's something in it I want to examine now that I've had the distance. The thing about understudies is this: they know every line. They have put in every hour of rehearsal. They are fully capable of carrying the performance. The reason they're the understudy and not the lead isn't talent. It isn't effort. It's often nothing more than circumstance or timing, or the fact that someone else stepped into the spotlight first, and the architecture of the theatre only accommodated one person at the centre. I was a good understudy. I was reliable and prepared, and I showed up without complaint to rehearsals that were often for a show where I would not perform. I learned lines I never got to speak. I stood in the wings while someone else took the stage. But here is the thing about understudies that I also want you to understand. They have a choice. They can stay in the wings indefinitely, waiting for a circumstance that may never arrive, or they can walk out of that theatre and go find a stage that was built with them in mind. I'm not saying, and I have never said, that my mother's love was wrong or inadequate or should be discarded. I am saying it was shaped in a particular way that didn't quite fit me, and that I spent a long time trying to fit myself to it instead of the other way around. The work I have done, the silence, the honest conversation, the slow and imperfect recalibration, has been the work of building a relationship that fits us both. Not perfectly, not without history, but honestly. I'm also saying that the stage I built for myself, in Seattle, in my work, in my chosen family, in my relationship with Tobias, is real. It is mine, and no one gave it to me. I made it, piece by piece, in the years when no one was watching, from the skill and the knowledge and the hard-won understanding of a woman who learned, very early, to generate her own light. There is a specific thing I want to say to anyone who has read this far and recognized something of themselves in it. And I know some of you have, because this pattern, the backup child, the conditional affection, the parent who turns toward you when the preferred child isn't available, is not unique to my family. It is a pattern that I have seen in my clients, and in my research, and in the private conversations that happen when people finally feel safe enough to say out loud what they've known quietly for years. Here is what I want to say to you. It is not about love. Whatever dynamic you're living in, whatever role you've been assigned, it is almost never about love. The parents who create these patterns almost always love all their children. They love in a particular shape that doesn't fit some of them as well as others. This is painful, and it is real, and it is worth naming. But naming it is different from concluding that you were not loved. You were probably loved. You may just have been loved in a way that left you chronically hungry. The hunger is real. The hunger is worth taking seriously. You are allowed to name it. You are allowed to require that it be addressed. You are allowed to stop participating in the version of the relationship where you are always second, always contingent, always available when the first choice isn't. These are not dramatic demands. These are, at minimum, the things that any person in any relationship has the right to require. And if the relationship cannot accommodate these things, if naming the pattern destroys it, if requiring basic regard is treated as aggression, then that information is also worth having. Not all relationships are worth preserving on the terms they're offered. Some relationships you have to let go of to find out whether something better can grow in the space. In my case, something better did grow. Imperfectly, slowly, with setbacks and recurrences and moments where I had to remind myself that progress is not linear, and that 2 steps forward and 1 step back is still 1 step forward, but something grew. I want to tell you about Diane's wedding, which happened in September. The vineyard in the Hudson Valley was as beautiful as advertised. The day was warm with a slight edge of autumn to it. That particular September light that is golden and a little elegiac. Diane was extraordinary. She has always been someone who knows how to occupy a moment, and this was her moment, and she inhabited it fully. I stood up at the altar in a green dress that I actually liked, which is a miracle in the history of bridesmaid fashion, and I watched my sister marry a man who seemed genuinely good and who was clearly, completely in love with her. My mother cried through the ceremony. My father, who I haven't told you nearly enough about because he is a whole separate story, reached over and held her hand, which is a gesture so characteristic of him that it almost made me cry too. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour, my mother found me and said, "Emma, thank you for being here." I said, "Of course, I wouldn't have missed it." She looked at me for a moment, really looked at me the way she had started learning to do. She said, "I know you probably had doubts about being here, about whether it was," she paused, "whether things had changed enough." I said I had some doubts. She said, "I'm glad you came anyway." "Me too," I said, and I meant it. At dinner I was seated next to my aunt, the one whose birthday dinner had occasioned the October text, which now felt like something from a different era, and across from a cousin I liked and a friend of Diane's I'd met at the bachelorette weekend. The dinner was good. The speeches were genuinely funny. At one point my mother, seated several places down, caught my eye and gave me a small, real smile that was just for me. Not for the table, not for the occasion. For me. I smiled back. This is what change looks like. A small smile across a dinner table. A mother who finally, imperfectly, is learning to see her second daughter clearly. A second daughter who has stopped trying to be seen on her mother's schedule and started requiring that she be seen on her own. My name is Emma Thompson, and I am 29 years old, and I am almost done telling you this story, but not quite, because there are a few things left to say. I got my therapist's license in July. Dr. Patricia Nguyen attended the ceremony. She brought a card that said, "You were going to be great at this from the moment I met you. Now you're licensed to prove it." I have the card on my desk. I look at it on the days when the work is hard, which it often is. Tobias and I got married in October, 1 year, almost to the day, after the text that changed things. We had a small wedding in a garden in Seattle with 23 people, which was everyone we most wanted and no one we didn't. My mother came. She made a toast that was genuine and warm and specific. She talked about who I was, not in relation to anyone else, just me, Emma, her daughter. She made a joke about my childhood obsession with the water filtration science project, which I had not known she remembered. I laughed through it, which is not a thing I do elegantly. Diane and her new husband were there. Halima was there. Dr. Nguyen was there. My father, who I haven't told you nearly enough about, danced with me at the reception to a song we both agreed on after a negotiation that lasted 3 phone calls and was one of the most pleasurable arguments of my life. At some point in the evening, I stood at the edge of the dance floor and watched all the people I loved in one room, and I thought about the kitchen doorway, about learning to braid, about 12 minutes late to a piano recital, about the October text and the months of quiet and the 47-minute call in November, and the tell me everything that followed and the small smile across the dinner table at Diane's wedding. I thought about what it had cost, not in a bitter way, in an accounting way. Here is what it cost: years of living in second place and calling it home, years of adjusting myself to fit a space that was always a size too small, years of the specific exhaustion of loving someone who loves you back but loves someone else first and not namming it and carrying the weight of the unnamed thing. Here is what was on the other side of the cost: this room, these people, this version of myself, the one who had stopped accommodating a ceiling and started building a roof she actually wanted to live under, the one who had learned the difference between being loved and being loved well, and had required the latter. I am not my mother's backup plan anymore. That role no longer exists in our relationship because I stopped filling it. The gap my refusal created was uncomfortable for a while, and then my mother filled it, not with Diane, not with a substitute, but with something closer to the real thing. Closer to an actual, present, primary attention. We are not perfect, we will never be perfect. My mother will drift toward Diane sometimes because Diane is loud and present and calls every day and requires maintenance in ways that are more legible to my mother. I will sometimes feel the old contraction when I notice the drift. I will say something. She will notice. We will reorient. This is the practice now. The ongoing, imperfect practice of 2 people who love each other and are learning late to do it better. I want to end with something I've been circling around for the entire length of this story, something I've been working my way toward in the way you work your way toward the hardest truth in a session, through everything adjacent to it, feeling the edges, until you finally sit down across from it and say, "Here you are. Here it is." For most of my life I was waiting for my mother to see me. Really see me not as the other daughter, not as the reliable one, not as the backup, just as Emma, the specific interior, science fair ribbon earning, piano playing, eventually doctorate having person I was and am. I waited very patiently for a very long time. I got partial glimpses, the health scare calls, the 20 minutes after my graduate school acceptance, the birthday song in the slightly off-key voice. I hoarded these glimpses like they were rare, which they were. I hoped every time that the glimpse was the beginning of a sustained seeing. What I have learned, what I have finally, fully arrived at understanding, is that I couldn't wait for that. Not because it wasn't coming, not because she was incapable of it, but because the waiting itself was part of the problem. When you position yourself as someone awaiting recognition, you participate in the dynamic that withholds it. You make yourself a supplicant in a transaction that should be reciprocal. You give the other person enormous power over your experience of yourself by tying that experience to whether or not they see you. The answer was not to stop caring whether she saw me. I am not made of stone, and the pretense of not caring is its own form of harm, the answer was to stop making her seeing of me a prerequisite for my living fully, to stop managing my own visibility according to her attention, to be fully and completely Emma, loudly, quietly, proudly, imperfectly in the presence and in the absence of her recognition, to see myself first and let everything else follow from that. When I stopped waiting, something shifted, not just in me, though it shifted enormously in me, but in our relationship. Because the relationship I had been in was built, partly, on my availability as an eager audience for her primary attention toward Diane. When I stepped out of that role, when I stopped being available to play the secondary character who never complained about being secondary, the dynamic had to reorganize itself. And in the reorganization, she had to look at me, actually look at me, and figure out what to do with what she saw. What she saw, I think, surprised her. She found a daughter who had become, in the years she'd spent mostly watching Diane, someone quietly extraordinary. Someone who had built a whole life in the space that her family's attention had overlooked. Someone who could sit with hard things and name them without cruelty. Someone who could love her still after everything, not naively, not without conditions, but genuinely and with eyes open. I think she is glad she looked. I know I am glad I waited, and then stopped waiting. My name is Emma Thompson. I am 29 years old. I am a licensed therapist in the state of Washington, a wife, a daughter, a sister, a friend. I grew up feeling like the backup plan in my own family, like the character the story cut away from as soon as the main event was available. I spent years accommodating this, calling it love, calling it home. And then I stopped. Not with drama, not with ultimatums or confrontations or principled speeches. I stopped with a text message I didn't answer, and a silence I held, and an honest conversation I finally had, and a slow and imperfect recalibration that is still ongoing and will probably always be ongoing. Because that is the nature of real relationships between real people who love each other. What I learned, what I know now bone deep, in the way you know the things you've earned rather than been given, is this. You cannot wait for someone else to decide you're the main character in the story. You have to decide it yourself, not arrogantly, not by diminishing anyone else's story, but firmly, clearly, with full knowledge of what it costs and what comes after. What comes after isn't a perfect family. What comes after is a true one. Smaller, maybe, more honest, with a different shape than the one you hoped for when you were 7 years old in the kitchen doorway, watching your mother braid your sister's hair, but real, yours. I think about that 7-year-old sometimes. I think about what I would tell her if I could. I would tell her you're going to learn to braid anyway, not to ask for anything, just because you love the way it feels, the crossing over and the weaving through, the way something loose and separate becomes something whole. And someday you're going to sit in your own kitchen in a city across the country, and you're going to braid your own daughter's hair. Yes, your daughter, she's coming, she's on her way, and you're going to do it in your slightly imperfect way, and she's going to lean into your hands, and you're going to know, without anyone having to tell you, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. I would tell her the piano recital mattered, you played beautifully, Mrs. Pulowski was right. I would tell her you were never a backup plan, you were always the plan, you just had to be the first one to believe it. If you've read this far, if any of this has landed somewhere real in you, if you recognize the backup plan, the inconsistent warmth, the pattern of conditional availability, I want to say something directly to you. The relationship you deserve is one where you are primary, not to everyone, not in every room, but in your own home, in your own family, in your own life, primary, not performed as primary, actually seen. You are allowed to name the pattern, you are allowed to stop participating in it, you are allowed to let the silence exist and see what happens, you are allowed to require honesty and consistency, and to be unavailable when the terms being offered are wrong. You don't have to cut people off to do this. You don't have to burn anything down. You just have to stop cooperating with the version of things that treats you as secondary. Stop being available as a backup. Stop shrinking to fit a space that was always a size too small. And then see who follows you into the new space, who is willing to renegotiate, who is capable of seeing you when you stop making it so easy to overlook you. Some people will surprise you. My mother surprised me, in the ways that mattered most. When I finally stopped making it so comfortable to disappoint me, she showed up, imperfectly, gradually, in small and real moments that added up to something. Some people won't follow, and that information, though it hurts, is also worth having. But here is the thing I most want to leave you with. Before anyone else sees you, before the reconciliation or the honest conversation or the small smile across the dinner table, you have to see yourself, completely, as the primary fact of your own life, not a supporting character in someone else's, as someone whose story matters, whose recital matters, whose science fair ribbon matters, whose joy and achievement and hard work and love and fear and grief all matter, every day, whether anyone is watching or not. See yourself first. Let everything else come from that. My name is Emma Thompson, and I am finally, fully, the main character in my own story. I think I always was. I just had to stop letting anyone else tell me otherwise. 4 plates, it's a start. That's what my mother said the first time she came to Seattle, the second visit, the one after everything had shifted. She had made dinner in my apartment, a thing she'd asked to do and I'd said yes to. She made the pasta dish she used to make when Diane and I were small, the one with the cream sauce and the fresh herbs that smells like a specific version of childhood. She set the table, 4 plates for her and my father and me and Tobias, and before we sat down she looked at me and said quietly, 4 plates, it's a start. I didn't know at first what she meant exactly, and then I did. She meant, this table, this kitchen, this version of us, the version where she comes to me instead of me always going to her, the version where she sees my life, the city I chose, the apartment I built, the man I love, the work I do, and fits herself into it instead of requiring me to fit myself into hers, the version that has room in it for me as a full and primary person. 4 plates, a start. We sat down. My father made us all laugh within 5 minutes, which is his gift and has always been his gift. My mother passed the bread and asked Tobias about his week and asked me about my clients, not specifically but the shape of the week, and listened to the shape of the answer. The cream sauce pasta tasted exactly like I remembered it, which is the thing about certain foods, they travel through time perfectly, unchanged, carrying everything you ever felt while eating them. After dinner, my mother and I did the dishes together, side by side in my kitchen, in the way that people do when they are comfortable, not performing, not careful, just present. She handed me dishes to dry. I dried them. The window above the sink faces west, and the Seattle evening light came through it at an angle that made everything gold. She said, I missed you, these years. I said, I was here. She said, I know, that's what I mean, you were here and I kept, she paused. I kept not being. I thought about whether to say it, then I said it, you're here now. She looked at me, her eyes were a little wet, which I pretended not to notice. I'm trying, she said. I know, I said, me too. We finished the dishes. Tobias and my father had moved to the living room and were deep in some conversation about something. I could hear my father's voice, animated and warm. My mother dried her hands on the kitchen towel and hung it back on the hook, and then she hugged me. Not a quick pat on the back hug, a real one, the kind that lasts long enough to actually land. I hugged her back. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a repaired childhood or recovered years or the experience of being a first-choice daughter from the beginning. It was a hug in a kitchen in Seattle on a Tuesday evening, between a mother and a daughter who were learning, late and imperfectly, and with genuine effort to be honest with each other. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the start.